1966 was the first year of Formula One's 3-litre era, and the sport really did enter its most dangerous years at this point. But at that year's Belgian Grand Prix, a crash involving one of the greats started a movement that has never gone away since. Safety. And that year John Taylor died of injuries sustained at the Nürburgring, which at that time was in the old 14-mile configuration. Now, the old Spa circuit, if you've ever played Grand Prix Legends or tried out the old version in R Factor 2, was a public road that was shut off every so often so they could hold a motor race, and the circuit itself was a mammoth 14-kilometre long track and one of the fastest in the world. It had something like one heavy braking zone, and that was for La Source, which at that time was the end of the lap rather than at the start of the lap that we know today. When the circuit got to Lake Coombe, the track branched off to the left and ran towards the village of Malmedy, then up the Master Straight towards Stavelot, and punctuating that straight was a chicane. I mean, I say chicane, it was a left-right flick that even in 1966 was approached at speeds bordering on 185 miles an hour. 185 in a bathtub on wheels with several gallons of high-octane fuel behind your head. And the track is no stranger to wet weather either. Just look at this year's Belgian Grand Prix, where the field barely did 2 laps because of the sheer amount of spray being lobbed up into the air. You know, honourable mentions also go out to 1997, which was the first Formula 1 race to start behind a safety car, 1989, which was, you know, a bit wet, and the controversial 2008 Belgian Grand Prix, which was the one where an anonymous Felipe Massa somehow won after a penalty was given to Lewis Hamilton for gaining an advantage at the chicane. The Ardennes weather can change on a sixpence, and that's what happened when the F1 teams and drivers all arrived in Belgium during the June of 1966. While Formula 1 was now in the 3-litre era, some teams weren't running 3-litre engines. 3 litres was just the cap, so Jackie Stewart's BRM, for instance, only ran a 2-litre engine, as the H16 that BRM had been working on wasn't particularly good. And Lotus also ran a 2-litre engine for most of the season, if not all of the season, and Clark had used that 2-litre engine to win at Watkins Glen. And this was the thing about F1 in those days, you could have a team running one engine for a bit, and then they'd switch to another one later in the season. And Lotus actually did this because they ran a Lotus 33 with a Climax engine in the back, and then swapped to a BRM engine later on when the 43 came into service. The Walker Racing team also did this, even going as far to change chassis mid-season. What they did was they ran a Brabham BT11 for a couple of races with a BRM engine in the back, and then swapped to a Cooper chassis with an engine from Maserati in the back. Imagine Haas swapping from Ferrari to Renault engines mid-season. Wouldn't happen. The 3-minute 49 lap record that was set in 1964 looks set to be beaten because obviously the cars had bigger engines and therefore more horsepower, but nobody was expecting Jackie Stewart to bang in a 342. Now Ferrari had another 1000cc available to them because they had the full 3-litre engines available. So once Stewart had done his 42, Ferrari were thinking that a 40 would not be impossible. Surtees went and did a 38 in qualifying. So the 15 cars that had turned up for the race lined up on the grid for the start of the Belgian Grand Prix, which was shortened compared to the previous year with 20 laps over the usual 32. Now Surtees was on pole with Rindt and Stewart in behind, and in fact, Surtees' pace in qualifying had been so blinding he was 3.2 seconds faster than Rindt and had 3.5 over Sir Jackie. But in the distance, rain was rolling in, and it had already reached Malmedy when the race was in the final stages before going green. But when the race did go green, that rain had reached Stavelot. Joe Bonnier and former US Vice President Mike Spence went off at Bournonville. Hill and Stewart disappeared on the Master Straight, and then the field ran to La Source for lap 2 with Surtees still leading. But only 7 cars started the second lap. With the exception of Phil Hill's McLaren that was being used as a camera car, Siffert, Hulme, Clark, Hill, Spence, Bonnier, Bondurant and Stewart failed to come round, and Clark was the only one of those not to be involved in an accident. His engine seized on the grid or something like that. He eventually got it going, but then it packed up again about a mile and a half later. All the others who managed to crash somehow got out of their cars and was not injured beyond, being a bit bruised and a bit shaken up, but Stewart was still missing. When Hill retired, he could see something in the distance and decided that he was going to go and investigate. And when he arrived at the exit of the Master Kink, he found a car and driver that he quipped looked very second-hand. Now Bob Bondurant, who had crashed in a similar spot to Hill, managed to crawl out of his car and joined Hill to find Stewart still in his BRM. The fuel tank had ruptured and fuel had spilled into the cockpit, so he was literally sitting in a bath of fuel, and the fuel pump, which was electric, was still on. So one spark, a whole lot's going up. But what had happened? Now, in Jackie's own words, "We just ran into a wall of water in the way it can only rain in Belgium. First I hit a telegraph pole and then a woodcutter's cottage, and I finished up in the outside basement of a farm building. The car ended up in the shape of a banana and I was trapped inside it. The fuel tank had totally ruptured inwardly and the monocoque literally filled up with fuel. It was sloshing around in the cockpit. The instrument panel was smashed, ripped off and found 200 metres from the car, but the electric fuel pump was still working away. The steering wheel wouldn't come off and I couldn't get out." Hill managed to get the fuel pump off and he and Bondurant tried to lift Stewart out of the car, but they couldn't because the steering wheel was trapping the Scots legs in the car, and no marshals bothered to turn up to help while trying to get Stewart out. Hill and Bondurant were getting covered in that same high-octane fuel that was in danger of igniting and also starting to burn the skin of all three drivers. Bondurant had to borrow a toolkit from a spectator to get the steering wheel off, and after 25 minutes they finally had Stewart out of the car and carried him into a nearby barn. Stewart then had Hill take off his racing suit as 25 minutes in a bath of fuel was really burning his skin, and Stewart had also broken a shoulder and broken several ribs. Now Stewart recalls, "3 nuns came in, and spotting a naked man in the back of a hay truck they put my clothes back on. Graham found an ambulance and then he took my clothes back off again." You'd think Jackie would have been out of the woods by now, but nah. A knackered ambulance picked him up and took him to some building that was being used as a medical centre, and they just left him on the floor on an old canvas stretcher that probably was used during the war, and he was left on the floor surrounded by cigarette ends in something that should never have been used for medical treatment. So another ambulance turned up to take him to a proper hospital, but this was still something out of an episode of Top Gear because the police escort somehow lost the ambulance and the ambulance driver didn't know how to get to the hospital in nearby Liège. So eventually Stewart had to be flown back to the UK for treatment, and while recovering he convinced his boss at BRM, Lewis Stanley, to join him in lobbying for better safety barriers and improved emergency services at races. He also taped a spanner to the steering wheel of his car just in case, and while pressing the circuit owners to improve the safety of the courses and all that stuff, which would have been done at the circuit owner's expense, he became the most hated man in Formula 1. But Jackie ended up getting most of the drivers on his side, and through doing so he managed to boycott the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa in 1969, the Nürburgring in 1970 and Zandvoort in 1972. Now with Spa and the Nürburgring it was a big deal, and it was also a wake-up call for virtually all of the circuit owners because they were all too arrogant to think the drivers would never boycott the 2 greatest racetracks in the world. But they did. But Stewart said it himself, "I would have been a much more popular world champion if I had always said what people wanted to hear. I'd have been dead, but certainly more popular." So that's the story of how Jackie Stewart's infamous accident in 1966 turned him into motorsport safety advocate. If you've learned something new here today, then be sure to give the video a thumb up. And for more stuff like this, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already and get that bell on so you never miss out on a future video. Massive thanks go out to the good folk of Patreon. If you do want to give me a monthly tip, you can do so by following the link in the description, where there's also a link to Discord and also some vague directions to all my socials. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind. Have a great day wherever you live in the world, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Goodbye.